Are you a new or returning PC builder confused about how to build a PC in 2025? We've got you covered. Welcome back to PC Builder, I'm Jason. This PC Parts Explained 2025 video will cover the most critical PC parts for your PC build, explain how they work together, and will offer specific CPU and GPU combos for 2025 to get you started. If you get value out of this video, please give it a like and of course subscribe for more cool PC content. Let's jump into it. There are 7 critical components to a PC build in 2025. The computer processor, or CPU for short, the graphics card, or GPU for short, the motherboard that connects things together, the RAM, the CPU cooler, the storage like an SSD drive, the power supply, and the PC case with airflow fans. For gaming PC builds in 2025, the graphics card, or GPU for short, is the most important component to get right. Now, your GPU will determine what resolution that you're going to be able to play at, 1080p, 1440p, or 4K, and how many frames per second or FPS you're going to get. Most PC gamers are looking for about 60 FPS at high to ultra details in single-player titles like Black Myth Wukong or Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and much higher FPS in multiplayer competitive titles like Marvel Rivals and CS2. Graphics cards are made by NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel. Now in 2025, we're in the middle of a launch of a new generation of graphics cards. NVIDIA is launching their RTX 50 series, AMD is launching its RX 9000 series, and Intel is launching its Battlemage or B series of graphics cards. You also might find previous generation graphics cards like NVIDIA's RTX 4000 or 3000, AMD's RX 6000 or 7000 GPUs, or Intel's A-series GPUs. But those are generally disappearing from retailers in favor of the new graphics cards. As I'm filming, things are a bit sold out while we wait for stock of the new graphics cards to catch up with demand. We do a monthly look at the best graphics card to buy right now, where we go through every budget level, and it's linked down in the video description when you're ready to buy a GPU. Now, the graphics card itself plugs directly into the motherboard and uses the video outputs on the back of the graphics card, not the motherboard. Now, PC gamers are going to want to use the DisplayPort cable rather than the HDMI cable for best results. We go through more on why that is in our Best Gaming Wire 2025 video, which is linked down in the video description, so you can check that out for a deeper dive. Now, one critical component of your graphics card is how much video RAM, called VRAM for short, that it has. This is different from the system RAM that the CPU uses. More on that in just a moment. And the graphics card comes with a fixed amount of VRAM that cannot be increased. In 2025, a number of graphics-intensive games will run out of VRAM if you don't have enough. This can lead to bad stuttering or the game just not loading textures, which makes everything look bland. In 2025, I recommend at least 10 GB of VRAM for most 1080p ultra details gaming, at least 12 GB of VRAM for most 1440p gaming, and at least 16 GB of VRAM for 4K gaming. Graphics cards with 8 GB of VRAM like the RTX 4060, they're really for budget gaming or gamers that just focus on competitive multiplayer titles at lowered graphics settings. If you want to stream your gameplay to a service like Twitch or YouTube Gaming, do video capture of your desktop or gameplay, or do video editing, the good news is that NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel GPUs are all very good at these workloads. Now let's jump into the Central Processing Unit, or CPU. Now there are 2 major CPU makers, AMD and Intel. They make a variety of CPUs, but we're just going to focus on the consumer desktop CPUs today. The CPU connects into the motherboard, and it's the brain of the computer. But the CPU itself has more than one brain it can use at a time, called a core. Now, most modern processors are at least 4 cores and currently come in 6, 8, 10, 12, all the way up to 24 cores. The more cores, the more the CPU can do at once, though some tasks like gaming only really need between 4 and 8 cores depending on the game and how powerful the CPU is. Both AMD and Intel CPUs have cores that can do up to 2 tasks at the same time, something we call multi-threading. So when I say that the AMD Ryzen 5 7600 has 6 cores and 12 threads, that means it has 6 cores that can do roughly 2 things at the same time. Intel CPUs are a big little design, with big cores that they call performance cores and small cores, which they call efficiency cores, that are only single-threaded. The most currently relevant AMD CPUs are the Ryzen 9000 and 7000 series CPUs for most mid-range and high-end builds, and the Ryzen 5000 CPUs for very budget gaming builds. The currently relevant Intel CPUs are the new Core Ultra 200 series and their older 12th, 13th, and 14th generation CPUs. Currently, the fastest gaming CPU is the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, which has extra onboard memory called cache, stacked vertically on the CPU, hence the 3D in the name. AMD Ryzen CPUs are unlocked, meaning you can overclock them if you choose to. Intel CPUs, labeled with a K in the name, can be overclocked, but only on a compatible Z-series motherboard. Again, more on that later. but none of the other Intel CPUs can be overclocked. Newer generation CPUs without an F in the name come with integrated graphics like the Ryzen 7600X or Intel Core Ultra 5 245K. However, the integrated graphics are only strong enough for desktop-related tasks, not for gaming. Note that CPUs with an F in their name, like the Ryzen 7500F or Core Ultra 5 245KF, do not have integrated graphics. Intel CPUs have had issues over the past year. The 13th and 14th generation CPUs, particularly the high-end overclockable K CPUs like the i9-14900K, had degradation issues. That means they were essentially breaking for no reason. And if you're wondering, CPUs should last at least a decade at the same performance level. They should not break within a year or two. It does appear Intel has fixed that issue with updates to the firmware called the BIOS that controls how the motherboard applies power to the CPU. And their newest generation of Core Ultra CPUs has had weaker gaming performance that Intel has not been able to fix. You can check out our monthly Best CPU video where we go through the best CPU for gaming and creators for our current recommendations, but right now we are heavily leaning towards AMD CPUs until Intel launches its next generation. So what's the right CPU and GPU combo for you? Well, the great news is that we have a whole video dedicated just to this topic based on every budget level, and we're going to be updating it for 2025 once more graphics cards launch. When building a gaming PC, we want to get the fastest GPU that we can afford. Now, typically this is around half of our overall budget. Then we just want to get a CPU that won't bottleneck our GPU. For systems that are more focused on professional creator or production work that take advantage of more CPU power, we'd want to scale up our CPU a bit, but it might vary depending on the programs that you're using, so check the recommended specs for them. Let's talk about motherboards because this is one area that I see people either massively overspend or massively underspend on all the time. Now, the motherboard is the thing that all the components plug into and allows them to work together. Motherboards are made by manufacturers like Asus, ASRock, Gigabyte, and MSI, and they're made using what's called a chipset that's specific to AMD or Intel. So you cannot use an AMD CPU with an Intel chipset motherboard and vice versa. And each CPU will only work with a specific chipset. For Ryzen 9000 and 7000 series CPUs, you want an AMD 800 or 600 series motherboard like a B850, B650, X670, or X870. For Ryzen 5000 CPUs, you generally want an AMD 500 series motherboard like a B550 chipset motherboard. For Intel Core Ultra 200, Intel 12th, 13th, and 14th generation CPUs with a K in their name, which again means they'll be overclockable, you'll likely want a Z-series motherboard, Z890 for Core Ultra 200, and Z690 or Z790 for 12th, 13th, or 14th generation Intel CPUs. For locked Intel CPUs, the ones without the K in their name, you want a B860 motherboard for Core Ultra 200 CPUs, and a B660 or B760 for 12th, 13th, and 14th gen Intel CPUs. It can be really confusing because both AMD and Intel use similar naming schemes for their motherboard chipsets, so just make sure that you check compatibility before you buy the motherboard. We've got buying guides for the best Ryzen motherboard 2025 and the best Intel motherboard that I'll leave linked down in the video description in our How to Build a PC playlist. Motherboards come in different sizes, with the most common being either a full-size ATX motherboard, a half-size version called a micro ATX or MATX motherboard, and an even smaller version with a single PCIe slot called a mini ITX motherboard. There's also a slightly wider version than normal board called an extended ATX or eATX. On the back of the motherboard, there will be USB ports of varying speeds, audio output for the onboard sound, wired and wireless networking, and display outputs if you're not using a dedicated graphics card. Motherboards also have either 2 or 4 slots for RAM, SATA connections for SATA storage drives, at least 1 slot for an M.2 storage drive, and connections for the system fans, RGB, and front PC case USB and audio plugs. The motherboard has an onboard operating system called the BIOS, which allows you to change the way that either the motherboard, the memory, or other components can run. One of the important motherboard features is the power delivery on the motherboard, called the VRAMs, a little half square around the CPU, which will often have a heatsink to avoid overheating under heavy use. You should pay close attention to these if you're using an 8-core or greater CPU. Then there are the PCIe Express slots called PCIe slots. The top one's for the graphics card and is a by 16 slot. That refers to the number of PCIe lanes and also the length of the connection. And they vary in size depending on how much bandwidth they have, including by 8, by 4, and by 1 slots. Note that smaller add-in cards can be used in the larger slots. PCIe lanes can go different speeds, and the currently fastest ones are PCIe Gen 4 and PCIe Gen 5. Check out our best motherboard videos for more on PCIe speed, audio, and other motherboard features. RAM, also called memory, is what systems use to temporarily store information it's using right now. For RAM, there are a couple of important things to know, like how much you need, how fast the RAM is, and whether or not you need to get DDR4 or DDR5 RAM, as we're still in transition between the two. Now, we have a whole video on the best RAM for gaming, which goes over all the available CPUs and recommendations for specific RAM for each one of them, as well as explain how RAM works. So check that out in the How to Build a PC playlist in the video description. RAM comes in sticks, they're called DIMMs, and generally bought in kits of 2 or 4 sticks. You generally want to use RAM sticks in pairs, so avoid a single stick or 3 sticks, and we never recommend mixing and matching different kits. Current RAM comes either in DDR4 or DDR5. The number at the end just notes the generation. Older Ryzen 5000 CPUs only use DDR4 RAM, while Ryzen 9000 and 7000 series CPUs only use DDR5 RAM. Intel Core Ultra 200 CPUs only use DDR5 RAM, while Intel 12th, 13th, and 14th generation CPUs can use either DDR4 or DDR5, but not both at the same time. That choice is locked in when you buy the motherboard, and the board specs will say whether it's a DDR4 or DDR5 motherboard. Most common memory speeds for DDR4 are between 3200 and 3600, and for DDR5 kits from 5600 to 6000, all the way up past 8000, though faster RAM does not always give better performance, and most CPUs have a sweet spot for RAM speed. In order to achieve these speeds, most RAM comes with an auto overclocking profile like XMP or EXPO, which you will need to enable in the BIOS in order to get it to run at its full rated speed. RAM also has a CAS latency rating, abbreviated CL or C with a number. Common CAS latencies for DDR4 are CL14, CL16, and CL18, and for DDR5 they range from CL28 to CL40 on the mainstream kits. The lower the CAS latency, the better. There is a lot to talk about for the best RAM speeds for each of the CPUs, so check out that best RAM for gaming video linked down in the video description. So how much RAM do you need in 2025? Well, it depends on what you're doing, but a general rule of thumb is at least 32 gigabytes for gaming, streaming gameplay to a service like Twitch, or amateur video editing. For professional level streaming or production workloads, the minimum I recommend is definitely 32 gigabytes, but if you're designing a system specifically for professional applications, then of course check out the recommended system specs, as you may need more memory. Note that most of the DDR5 kits available on the DIY PC market are a minimum of 32 gigabyte kits, so that's plenty for most users. And of course, RAM can come with RGB, which is just a lot of fun. Let's talk about storage, because it's seen massive changes over the past couple years as cost for solid state storage, called SSDs, has fallen to the point that I would no longer consider spinning hard disk drives for any role in my PC build, even for bulk data storage. Yes, I know some people are going to be super upset by that. Also, the older SATA SSDs that connected via cable have been completely replaced by NVMe SSDs that use the M.2 connector on your motherboard and are significantly faster. So for the best PC build 2025, we're focusing exclusively on M.2 NVMe SSDs, and you can currently find storage starting around $50 for 1 terabyte. With how cheap SSD storage has become, I recommend at least 1 terabyte of storage. 2 terabyte drives can be had for under $100, while the best price per terabyte is now 4 terabyte drives. And you don't need a separate boot and storage drive like in the old days. A single high capacity drive is absolutely fine for most non-professional users. NVMe SSDs come in a variety of speed called PCIe generations, which we abbreviate as Gen. For the vast majority of consumers, PCIe Gen 3 drives are actually faster than you need, but Gen 4 drives are also very cheap. The newest Gen 5 drives really don't offer consumers any benefit. They're twice as expensive as PCIe Gen 3 or Gen 4 drives, and only the latest CPUs and motherboards will even run them at their full rated speed. My advice is just skip PCIe Gen 5 drives and get a nice PCIe Gen 3 or Gen 4 one instead. Heck, double the capacity. Do note that PCIe is backwards compatible, so you can always plug in a PCIe Gen 3 drive into a motherboard with a PCIe Gen 4 or even Gen 5 slot. It's just going to run at the slower rated speed, which is still really fast. Alternatively, if you do plug a Gen 5 drive into a motherboard that only supports Gen 3 drives, it will run, but only at the Gen 3 speed. We have a best SSD video that goes into more detail if you want a deeper dive. Let's talk about CPU coolers, because they have become increasingly important in 2025 as CPU makers look to push their chips as fast as possible, eating more power and producing more heat. Basically, if your CPU overheats, it will throttle your performance, and that's bad. Generally, the more cores a CPU has, the more power it requires. And I'm looking at you, Intel i9 14900K and the more cooling it will require. You can do that with an air cooler, an all-in-one liquid cooler, also called an AIO, or with a custom-built liquid loop cooler. If this is your first PC build or your first build in a while, I recommend skipping the custom loop cooler. Just go straight for either an air cooler or an all-in-one liquid cooler. Note that some Ryzen and Intel CPUs come with included box coolers. For Ryzen 5000 CPUs, the Ryzen 7700 and the Ryzen 7900 non-X CPUs, these coolers are fine, but I generally recommend upgrading them. For most Intel CPUs, other than the lower-end Core Ultra 5 225 and the i5 12400, I recommend upgrading at least to a budget tower air cooler. We have cooling guides in our How to Build a PC playlist, and we recommend specific coolers for each CPU in our build guide lists, so check those out in the video description. Let's talk PC cases and fans. Your PC case has 3 jobs. Number 1, keep your PC parts safe. Number 2, get your PC parts airflow to keep them from thermal throttling. And number 3, look amazing. For airflow, it's important to bring in cool air from the outside and vent out hot air from the inside to avoid thermal throttling. For this, mesh front or side panels are best. While we can buy additional fans and often need to, PC cases usually come with at least a couple of included fans in the 120mm and 140mm size, though there are some cases with much larger 160mm and even 200mm fans. Note that the larger the fan, the slower it needs to spin to bring in the same amount of airflow, and the quieter it can be, though some fans are noisier than others even when spinning at the same speed. How many fans do you need? I recommend at least 2 to 3 intake fans, as well as at least 1 exhaust. In high-end builds with more heat, I'd recommend increasing this airflow. Slightly biasing our fans to intake also allows us to create positive pressure inside the PC case, and that allows us to control the amount of dust that's getting into the case. Of course, like motherboards, PC cases come in different sizes. ATX cases will fit ATX and smaller size motherboards, while micro ATX cases will not fit an ATX full-size motherboard, and many small form factor cases will only fit mini ITX motherboards. If you're not sure, check the PC case specs before buying it to make sure it's going to fit your motherboard. Finally, let's talk aesthetics and front panel connections. Most cases come with a glass side panel to show off your build, and the front panel of your case will include a USB port and audio jacks. If it has a front panel USB Type-C connector, you'll want to ensure that your motherboard comes with the right header for it. Some cases come with RGB lighting effects or strips, but most RGB lighting today is on the fans, coolers, RAM, and the motherboards themselves. All right, power supplies. The power supply unit, or PSU for short, basically supplies power to your PC build. But choosing the right PSU, it's really complicated. Don't worry, we have a whole video that explains how to size, evaluate, and actually buy the best PSU, including our How to Build a PC playlist. Now, PSUs come in 2 main sizes: ATX, which is the most common, and SFX, which is for small form factor cases. Make sure to choose a PSU that fits your case. PSUs come in different wattages. They also have different efficiency rating, called 80+ ratings in either white, bronze, gold, or platinum. But these 80+ ratings, they don't necessarily indicate the unit's quality. Instead, we look at a rating system put together by knowledgeable community members called the PSU Cultist tier list. I know it sounds weird, but it is super helpful. For a gaming PC build with a dedicated GPU, we recommend using a PSU rated at least C tier or better on the PSU Cultist list. As performance and cost of your CPU and GPU go up, we suggest moving up the tier list to B, then A tiers. You can think of this a little bit like buying car insurance. The more expensive your car is, the more insurance coverage you're going to want, even though you're paying more money for that insurance. Again, check out our full PSU buying guide, linked down in the video description, before making your purchase. So how much do you need to spend on your PC build? Well, I'm doing this at the beginning of 2025, and since the new graphics cards are still launching, a lot of this stuff is out of stock or it's just higher priced. So hopefully if you're watching this in a couple months or later in the year, these prices should come down. And we regularly do monthly best build videos, which will be linked down in the video description for something more current. Right now, you can build a great budget gaming PC aimed at 1440p gaming for between $650 and $850. The $650 version relies on an older but still decent Ryzen 5600 CPU using the included stock cooler, a budget B550 motherboard, 32GB of DDR4 3200 CL16 RAM, an ARC B570 10GB graphics card, or possibly an upcoming RTX 5060 or RX 9060 graphics card, 1TB of NVMe SSD storage, a budget gaming PC case with ARGB fans, and a budget C-tier rated power supply. If you want to modernize the CPU platform, you can go with a Ryzen 7600 CPU and a budget tower air cooler, a B650 motherboard, and DDR5 RAM for about another $200. For between $1,000 and $1,200, we can do a very strong mid-range gaming PC aimed at very high refresh rate 1440p gaming. Now this build relies on a Ryzen 7600 or 7600X CPU with a budget tower air cooler, a budget B650 motherboard, 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 RAM, an RTX 5070 or RX 9070 class graphics card for between $500 and $600, a nice Atrium style micro ATX case, 1TB of SSD storage, and a budget 750 watt power supply. My next jump up here would be to get a bigger graphics card, but you could also spend a little bit more on your CPU with a Ryzen 9600X or Ryzen 7700X instead. For very high FPS gaming at 4K or insane 1440p frame rates, we can do a build around $2,000. We're going with the currently fastest gaming CPU in the Ryzen 9800X 3D, a dual tower air cooler, a premium B850 motherboard, 32GB of DDR5 RAM with RGB, an RTX 5080 graphics card, 2TB of SSD storage, a very nice Atrium style ATX sized PC case, and an A-tier rated 1000 watt power supply. Check out our monthly build list linked down in the video description for even more possibilities. Let's also briefly mention the other items you're going to need for your PC, specifically a gaming monitor, a mouse and keyboard, along with audio equipment like speakers or a soundbar. We have a Best Gaming Monitor 2025 buying guide that I'll link down in the video description, where we go over all the great monitors that you can buy in 2025, anything from a super budget gaming PC monitor for $150 all the way up to amazing OLED gaming monitors for $500 to $1,000. The great thing about mice, keyboards, and speakers is that you can get some pretty decent ones for around $30 to $40 each, and you can upgrade them over time. Remember, everything is linked down in the video description. All the guides that we talked about, our monthly PC build lists, and of course some relevant CPUs and GPUs so you can start checking prices right now. If you got value out of this video, please give it a like, it makes a huge difference to the channel, and of course subscribe for more cool PC content. And we'll catch you on the next one.